The rain had started early that morning, a slow, steady drizzle that painted the small town of Maple Ridge in watercolor shades of gray. By late afternoon, the clouds hung low, pressing on the rooftops like an exhausted sigh. Elijah Carter wiped the sweat from his brow and leaned out from beneath the hood of an old Chevy that hadn't run properly in years. The fluorescent light above his workbench buzzed softly, mixing with the gentle patter of rain on the tin roof. He wasn't supposed to be at the shop that late. Fridays were usually for dinner with his sister and her boys. But work had been slow all week, and the bills were stacking up again. The kind of work he did, honest, greasy, hands-on, didn't make anyone rich. Still, he stayed, fixed what he could, cleaned what he couldn't. It was easier than going home. At 6:43 p.m., the bell above the shop door jingled. He turned. A woman, probably in her late 50s, stood soaked through, holding her purse like it might shiver out of her hands. Her car, a dark blue sedan, sat idling lopsided just outside the garage. One headlight out, a soft hissing coming from the hood. "Hi," she said, breathless. "I think I blew a hose or something. I saw the lights were still on." Elijah wiped his hands on a rag and stepped out. "You're lucky," he said, giving her a half smile. "I was just about to close up." She looked exhausted and grateful. "It's been a long day. I was driving back from my daughter's place, heard a pop near the highway exit, and limped in here." He walked to the car, gesturing for her to pop the hood. "Let me take a look." As steam hissed from the engine, Elijah leaned in with practiced calm. "Radiator hose split," he said after a moment. "Nothing serious. I can replace it now if you've got a little time." "I've got all the time in the world," she said, letting out a shaky laugh. Something about her tone struck him. Not quite sadness, but something close. It wasn't his business, though. Elijah had learned long ago not to ask questions he didn't want the answers to. While he worked, she stood off to the side, occasionally watching him, occasionally looking at the rain. "You remind me of someone," she said quietly after a while. He didn't look up. "I get that a lot." "No," she said. "I mean it. Same hands? Same way of moving." "My father was a mechanic." Elijah nodded, tightening the new hose. "Lot of us out there, fixing things that other people break." The woman smiled faintly. "Or things that break on their own." An hour later, the car was ready. He refused her payment, something he rarely did, and instead handed her a business card. "Come back if anything feels off," he said. "It's on the house tonight." She took the card and looked at him for a long moment. "You're kind. Not many people like that anymore." He shrugged. "Somebody helped me once a long time ago. Just paying it forward." She nodded, then got into her car. As she backed out of the shop, she rolled down the window. "What was your name, Elijah?" he said. "Elijah Carter?" She looked at him strangely, a flicker of recognition in her eyes like a word she couldn't quite place. Then she smiled again, soft and sad. "Thank you, Elijah," she said. "You remind me of home." The car disappeared into the rain. He didn't think about it again until 6 days later, when the envelope arrived. It was waiting in his mailbox. Weather-streaked and simple. No return name, just a city in New Hampshire he'd never visited. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded carefully, handwritten in ink. The words were kind, grateful, thanking him for helping a stranger in the rain. But Elijah barely noticed the message, because the handwriting was his father's. The same loops, the same slightly slanted E's, the same way the T's crossed too low. Elijah's hands began to shake. The world tilted. His father had been gone for over 20 years. Elijah stared at the letter for so long that the ink began to blur into shadows. The edges of the paper trembled in his hands, though the wind was still. He hadn't seen that handwriting since he was 10 years old the last birthday, before everything changed. He read the note again slowly this time. "Dear Elijah, thank you for your kindness. Not many people would have gone out of their way to help a stranger in the rain. The world could use more people like you. I just wanted you to know, sometimes the good we do in small moments echoes louder than we expect. With gratitude." A traveler passing through. There was no name, no hint of familiarity in the words themselves, But the handwriting. He turned the envelope over, looked at the return address again, Brayford, New Hampshire. A small town, if memory served. He'd never been there. Didn't know anyone who lived there. Except a memory, dusty and incomplete, surfaced in his mind, a map his father had once unfolded at the kitchen table years ago. Elijah remembered the name Brayford circled in red ink. That night, he sat on the floor of his garage office, pulling out a worn cardboard box from the back of a metal filing cabinet. Inside were old photos, receipts, birthday cards, fragments of a boyhood interrupted. Near the bottom, beneath a stack of oil-stained invoices, he found it the last letter his father had ever written to him. It had arrived 2 months after he vanished. Elijah had read it once, then never again. With a hesitant breath, he opened the envelope. "My son, I know this is not the letter you wanted, and I know this is not the way a father is supposed to leave. There are things I can't explain yet. Not because I don't want to, but because I promised someone I wouldn't. Please believe me when I say leaving wasn't the easy way out. It was the only way I saw to protect you from what was coming. One day, when the time is right, you'll understand. I hope you'll forgive me." Dad Elijah compared the letters side by side. His fingers traced the curves and strokes of the letters, the way the lowercase g looped like a backward 6. Identical. He felt like the room was getting smaller. Could it really be? He needed answers. The return address on the thank you letter was his only clue. By noon the next day, Elijah had called every number listed for Brayford's post office library and city records. No luck. Either disconnected or dead ends. Until he tried something else, an online search for the address itself. The address belonged to a man named Thomas R. Carter. His heart stopped at the surname, Carter. He clicked through the sparse information. No phone number, just a mailing address, no photographs, no social media. A listing on a local classified site showed a small-town mechanic shop for sale. It was tied to the same address. A mechanic's shop, under the name Carter. It could be a coincidence, could be someone else entirely. But Elijah didn't believe in coincidences, not when the handwriting on that letter was identical to the man who had shaped every part of his early life, only to disappear like a ghost. That night, Elijah couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan, spinning in slow, uneven circles. Memories bled into the room around him, his father's voice. The sound of old country music drifting through the garage. The smell of oil and pine after a long day's work. And that last day, the argument between his father and someone Elijah never saw. The slamming of the back door. The flashing of police lights hours later. The questions that never got answers. Elijah had spent 20 years burying the pain under wrenches, spark plugs, and the smell of gasoline. But now that pain had resurfaced, and it had come with a return address. He got out of bed just before dawn and went to the garage. The air was cool and still. He placed both letters, the old and the new, on the workbench beneath a bare bulb. Then quietly, he whispered to himself, "If it's you, Dad." Why now? The sun began to rise. He packed a small bag, grabbed his keys. Brayford wasn't on any major route, but Elijah had always been good at finding the places most people overlooked. The man who had once walked out of his life might finally be found in a small town Elijah had never seen, writing thank you letters in secret. He owed it to himself to find out the truth. The drive to Brayford was longer than Elijah expected. Nearly 8 hours through winding back roads, sleepy towns, and stretches of forest that felt untouched by time. The further he got from Maple Ridge, the more the landscape softened, like the world itself was urging him to let go of old grief, to make room for something new. But his heart wouldn't cooperate. He kept the letter beside him on the passenger seat, glancing at it during quiet stretches of highway, as if the words might shift or rearrange themselves into a clearer message. He tried not to let hope creep in too deeply. Hope was dangerous. It had disappointed him before. As dusk rolled in, Elijah across the town limits of Brayford. The welcome sign was Simple Brayford, a place to catch your breath. The streets were lined with maple trees and modest homes, and the scent of early fall lingered in the breeze. There were no billboards, no strip malls, just a town untouched by hurry. He found a cheap motel with a vacancy sign flickering weakly in the window and checked in. The room smelled faintly of cedar and disinfectant. As he dropped his duffel onto the bed, his eyes caught something he hadn't thought about in years, a Gideon Bible in the nightstand drawer. He didn't open it. Instead, he sat at the edge of the bed, took out the old cardboard box he'd brought with him, the one he'd dug out of his garage, and began pulling out the fragments of his father's memory. There were faded photographs, one of him as a toddler, sitting on the hood of a rust-colored truck, his father's calloused hands holding him steady. Another of the two of them, side by side in the shop, grease-streaked and proud. A third photo, more worn than the others, a blurry image of his dad and a man Elijah didn't recognize, both laughing arms around each other's shoulders like brothers. Underneath the photos was a smaller envelope, one Elijah didn't remember seeing before. It was unlabeled, brittle with time. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a letter. The date on the corner read June 3rd, 2004. Elijah's heart pounded. Tom, if you're reading this, I've made it out. I've held up my end of the bargain, but I can't stay. Not here. Not with him watching. Tell Elijah one day that I never stopped thinking about him, that I watched every birthday from a distance, that I wanted to come home, but coming home would have put him in danger. I know you think I'm a coward. Maybe I am. But I promised I'd protect him, and a promise is all I have left to offer. Take care of the boy if I don't make it back. He deserves more than silence. James, his father. Elijah sat there stunned. He read the letter again and again. There it was, the name Tom, and a promise he never knew had been made. The man who'd written the recent thank you letter. Could he be the same Tom? The one entrusted with watching over him from the shadows? Why hadn't anyone told him? The next morning, Elijah stood outside a modest mechanic's shop on the edge of Brayford. The sign above the entrance read simply, Tom's Auto. The place looked like it hadn't changed in 20 years. Rusted tools on a rack, an old cash register behind the desk, and a wooden bench painted red from a long faded advertisement. The front door was open. The scent of oil and thyme wafted out like a familiar song. He stepped inside. Be right with you. A voice called from the back. It was gravelly, aged, but unmistakably steady. Elijah's heart leapt. When the man emerged from the rear workroom, he was wiping his hands on a rag. Late 60s, maybe early 70s. Gray stubble, deep-set eyes. And when those eyes met Elijah's, they paused, frozen, as if recognizing a ghost. Elijah, the man said. Not a question. A statement. You know me. Tom nodded slowly. I've known you since you were in diapers. You look like him. Same jaw. Same way of looking around a room, like you're fixing it in your head. Elijah stepped forward. Did you write this? He held out the thank you letter. Tom took it, examined it, then let out a long, tired sigh. I was wondering how long it would take. So it is you, Elijah said. You're the one who wrote it, and that means... The handwriting. Tom nodded. Same as your father's. Because we wrote alike? Always did. Elijah's brow furrowed. But I don't understand. Tom motioned toward the bench. Sit down, son. There's a lot you don't know. And you deserve to hear all of it. The words landed like a promise. For the first time in 20 years. Elijah felt like the silence around his father's disappearance was about to break. Tom poured 2 mugs of black coffee from a rusted thermos and set one in front of Elijah. The air inside the small office of the garage was warm with the scent of old rubber and machine oil. And something else Elijah couldn't name. Maybe it was memory. The older man took a slow sip before speaking. I never meant for you to find out this way, Tom said. But I always knew you'd come looking. You've got your father's instincts. Elijah didn't touch his coffee. You knew him. You were close. Tom nodded. I was his older brother. The words hit Elijah like a bolt. He blinked, stunned. My uncle I am. Though I never got to be much of one. After he left, I promised him I'd keep my distance unless things got dangerous. He said you needed a clean break, a chance to grow up safe. Elijah swallowed hard. Why would he think I wasn't safe with him? Tom leaned back, his gaze drifting toward the shop's rain-streaked window. Because your father got into something years ago that spiraled beyond control. Something that started with money, ended in threats. He thought if he disappeared, you and your mother could be left alone. And when she passed, Elijah flinched. I was 10, I know, Tom said quietly. And he came to her funeral. You didn't see him, but I did. Stayed at the back, wore a baseball cap and dark glasses. Didn't say a word. But I swear, Elijah, I've never seen a man look more broken. Elijah's hands trembled in his lap. The image burned in his mind, a man hidden in shadows, while he stood beside a tiny casket, wondering why the only parent left to him hadn't come home. I hated him for leaving, Elijah whispered. Tom nodded. I did too, for a long time. But then I saw what he'd become, what he was sacrificing. A silence stretched between them. Outside, the rain fell soft and steady, as if the sky knew to tread gently on old wounds. Tom continued. He kept in touch in small ways. Letters he never sent. Birthday gifts he mailed to me and made me promise not to forward. Said watching from a distance was the only way he could keep you safe, that if he came close, he'd bring danger with him. But what danger, Elijah asked? What could be so bad that he had to disappear completely? Tom hesitated. Your father got involved with some men, loan sharks basically. Thought he could take out a loan to keep the family business afloat. But it got ugly. He was forced to do work for them he never spoke about. When he tried to pull out, they threatened to hurt you. Elijah shook his head, and instead of coming clean, he vanished. Tom gave him a sad smile. Sometimes, the bravest things look like cowardice on the outside. He made me swear I'd never tell you unless you came looking for the truth. And when I saw you at the shop last week, I knew the moment you said your name. I couldn't say it then. I didn't know if you'd come back. And the letter, Elijah asked, voice tight. Why write in his handwriting? Tom looked down at his hands. Because he taught me. We used to play a game forging each other's writing. It was our dumb way of sneaking notes when we were kids. Thought maybe, if I wrote to you like he would have, you'd feel something familiar. Maybe you'd come find me. Elijah stared at him. There was a lump in his throat he couldn't swallow down. A part of him wanted to scream, to demand to know why no one had tried harder to reach him. But a deeper part, the part still aching from all those fatherless years, just wanted one thing. Is he still alive? Tom's eyes clouded. That's the part I don't know. Elijah's heart sank. Tom went on. The last letter I got from him was 2 years ago. Said he was going to try and disappear for good. No contact, no trace. He called it his final withdrawal. And you haven't heard anything since? Tom shook his head. I don't even know if he's dead or alive, Elijah, but I know where he was last. Elijah leaned in. Where? There's another shop, Tom said. Small place, way off the map. He ran it for a few years, under a different name. When he left it, he left something behind for you. Said I was never to go there myself, just to send you when the time was right. Tom reached into a drawer and pulled out an old manila envelope. It had Elijah's name, written across the front in faded black ink. He slid it across the table. With hesitant fingers, Elijah opened it. Inside was a set of keys, a photograph of a garage nestled in the woods, and a short note. If you've come this far, then you're ready. The answers live where the silence was born. Dad Elijah stared at the handwriting, the real handwriting. Not forged, not mimicked, but his father's trembling slightly, but still familiar. He looked at Tom. Where is it? Tom pointed to the map, pinned to the wall behind them, faded and creased from years of use. He tapped a dot near the edge, just outside Red Hollow, middle of nowhere. But if he left you a key, he wanted you to find it. Elijah stared at the dot. He was already packing the route in his mind. The past wasn't done with him yet. The road to Red Hollow was little more than a whisper between pine trees, a narrow gravel path that twisted through hills and thickets like it was hiding something. Elijah drove with the windows down, letting the cool air rush in and tangle his thoughts. Every mile felt like peeling back a layer of time. He passed rusted mailboxes, scattered cabins, and signs that had long since faded. Civilization thinned, until it was just him, the engine's hum, and the distant call of birds. Somewhere his father had walked these same roads. Somewhere he had vanished into the quiet. The directions from Tom were precise, and just before noon, Elijah reached a clearing surrounded by tall pines. In the center stood a squat, wooden building, part garage, part cabin, its roof sagging with age ivy, climbing up its sides like time trying to erase it. A faded sign above the door read, "Carter & Sons Auto Repair." Elijah's chest tightened at the name. He'd never been A & Sons. Not really. But someone had once dreamed that he would be. He parked, stepped out, and approached the door. It creaked open without resistance. Inside, dust floated like mist in the sunbeams pouring through cracks in the roof. Tools still hung on the walls. A half-covered workbench sat near the window, scattered with yellowed papers, rusted bolts, and a worn-out coffee mug with the words "Best Dad Ever" printed in faded blue. Elijah moved through the space, slowly, as if afraid to break the silence. The garage wasn't abandoned. Not entirely. It felt paused, frozen mid-breath, as if someone had meant to return. In the corner, he spotted a trunk, padlocked. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the keys from the manila envelope. One of them clicked. Inside the trunk were stacks of notebooks wrapped in twine, and a metal box labeled simply Elijah. He opened the box with trembling hands. Inside were childhood drawings, stick figures of cars and monsters, all signed Elijah, age 6. A small baseball glove broken in and soft with time. A matchbox car he hadn't seen in decades, and beneath it all, letters, dozens of them. Each one was addressed to him. Each one dated from a birthday, a Christmas, or a first day of school. He picked one at random and read Elijah. "Today, you turned 12. I watched from across the street as you walked to school. You looked taller, braver. I wanted to hug you, to say how proud I am, but I couldn't risk it. I'm still being followed, still afraid. But I'm with you, son. Every step. Even if you can't see me." Dad Elijah sank to the floor. His eyes filled with tears as he read letter after letter, each one soaked with love, sorrow, and restraint. They painted a picture of a man who hadn't run away from love, but from danger. A man who had lived in the margins, watching, waiting, protecting. There were photographs too, distant shots of Elijah at school events, playing soccer, walking home from the store. Someone had followed him, not to harm him, but to hold on to him, even from afar. Elijah sat there for hours reading, until the sun dipped behind the trees and shadows crept across the floor. In one notebook, he found a different kind of entry. Less letter, more confession. "I've made mistakes. I won't pretend I didn't. I should have come back. I should have found a way to explain. But how do you tell a child that love sometimes looks like distance? That protection sometimes means breaking their heart? I left because I was scared, not of dying, but of what they'd do to him. Elijah was my everything. And when his mother died, I wanted nothing more than to come home. But I stayed away, because I believed that would save him. I don't know if I was right, but I know I loved him with everything I had." Elijah closed the book and rested his head against the wall. He wasn't angry anymore. He was hollow and full, and something in between. Eventually, he stood and walked to the center of the garage. The dust caught the fading light and shimmered like 1,000 quiet memories. Then, he noticed something odd, a tarp covering something large. He pulled it back. Underneath was a car, half restored. The frame polished the seats, reupholstered in a worn but loving hand. On the windshield was a sticky note. For Elijah. Finish it when you're ready. Elijah touched the hood. This was his father's final act of hope that someday his son would find this place and understand. He stood in that quiet garage, the air thick with ghosts and grease, and whispered to no one, "I'm here now." The building didn't answer, but something in Elijah's chest did. Elijah didn't leave Red Hollow right away. For 2 days, he slept on an old cot in the back of the garage, waking to the sound of birds in the trees, and working on the car his father had left him. He wasn't sure why he stayed. Maybe because it was the first place in years where the past didn't chase him, but welcomed him. Each bolt he tightened, each part he replaced felt like a kind of reunion. There were still so many things he didn't know: where his father had gone after writing those letters, why he had disappeared so completely, and most of all, if he was even still alive. Tom had offered one more thread, a name scribbled in the corner of one of the envelopes: Maggie. There was no return address, no context, just a first name. Tom said it had shown up in a few of James's letters too, and he believed she might have been the one helping him stay hidden. So Elijah followed it. Through a network of locals and a lucky conversation at a general store in a neighboring town, Elijah learned of a woman named Maggie Shaw who ran a small roadside cafe, Crossroads Cafe, about 30 minutes outside of Red Hollow. The kind of place you could miss if you blinked. The kind of place someone could disappear into. He drove there the next morning. The cafe sat nestled between two hills, painted a soft mint green, its porch shaded by a white overhang and a lone oak tree. Wind chimes danced lazily in the breeze. The sign in the window said, "Open," in handwritten cursive. Inside, it was quiet. A couple of elderly locals sat at the counter sipping coffee. The place smelled like cinnamon and warm maple syrup. Elijah walked up to the register, where a woman in her 60s was refilling the sugar jar. She had silver-streaked hair tied in a braid and soft, observant eyes. "Can I help you?" she asked, smiling. Elijah swallowed. "Are you Maggie Shaw?" She paused, not startled but aware. "Depends on who's asking." He extended a hand. "Elijah Carter. I think you may have known my father, James Carter." Her smile faltered. She didn't speak right away. She looked him over, not in a suspicious way, but in the way someone examines an old photograph, searching for something familiar. "You have his eyes," she said softly. "He always said you would." "Do you know where he is?" Elijah asked, trying not to let too much hope creep into his voice. Maggie gestured to a booth by the window. "Sit with me. We'll talk." He followed her, nerves tightening in his chest like piano wire. Once seated, she folded her hands on the table. "James stayed with me for a while, about 3 years ago. He was sick, not physically, but tired, worn down by years of hiding, of running from ghosts. I offered him a room. No questions asked. That's the kind of place this is. People stop here when they're lost." "Why didn't he come back?" Elijah asked. "Even after all the danger had passed," Maggie sighed. "Because by then, he didn't know how. Guilt is a strange thing. It tells you you're not worthy of forgiveness, even when it's right in front of you. He convinced himself that you were better off never seeing him again." "But I wasn't," Elijah said, his voice cracking. "I needed him. I still do." She nodded gently, reaching across the table to touch his hand. "I know." There was a long pause. Outside the window, a truck rumbled by, trailing dust and memory. "He left one morning before sunrise," Maggie continued. "Didn't say where he was going, just left a note saying thank you. That was the last I saw of him." Elijah stared at the tabletop, jaw clenched. "So he's still out there," maybe she said. "But if I know James, he wouldn't want you chasing shadows forever. He'd want you to live your life, build something, not just rebuild his." He pulled the photograph from his jacket pocket, the one Tom had given him of James, and another man-arms slung around each other like brothers. "Do you know who this is with him?" Elijah asked, sliding the photo across the table. Maggie picked it up, squinting. Her breath hitched. "Yeah," she whispered. "That's Benny Harrow. Used to work with James in a shop way back, before everything fell apart. Is he still around? She shook her head. Passed away 2 years ago. Cancer. James came here right after. Elijah sat back, frustrated, and lost again. He left something else, Maggie said. Hold on. She stood and disappeared into a back room. When she returned, she carried a small leather-bound journal. The corners were worn, the pages yellowed. He said, "If you ever came, to give you this." Elijah took it carefully. His name was etched into the cover. He opened to the first page. Elijah, if you're reading this, I'm already gone. But not in the way you think. I'm gone from hiding, gone from running. I left so you could see the world without waiting on a ghost. But if you found your way here, maybe we're both ready now. This is my story, not the one the world saw, but the one I carried. And somewhere in these pages, I hope you find not just the man I was, but the reasons I couldn't be what you needed. I love you. Always have. Dad Elijah closed the book and stared out the window. The cafe felt quiet again, but this time, it wasn't empty. He'd come looking for his father, and now, piece by piece, his father was coming back to him not in body, but in truth. Elijah didn't leave the cafe for a long time. He sat in the booth by the window, the journal resting, like a quiet weight in his hands. He hadn't opened another page yet. The first few lines had been enough to stir everything inside him: pain, confusion, hope, and a grief that had finally found its shape. Maggie brought him a plate of warm peach pie and a glass of sweet tea, neither of which he touched at first. "You don't have to read it all now," she said, sitting across from him again. "You've already carried this weight longer than any son should." Elijah looked down at the journal, running his thumb across the embossed letters of his name. "I'm afraid," he admitted. "Of what you'll find?" she asked. He nodded. "Or of what I won't." Maggie nodded slowly. "I understand. When James first came here, he wouldn't talk about anything. Wouldn't say his name. Wouldn't even look me in the eye for the first week. But every night I'd see him writing in that book. Sometimes crying, sometimes laughing, always writing." She paused. "Whatever's in there, it was meant for you." Elijah opened to the second page. His father's handwriting continued steady and patient, like a voice across time. "Do you remember the day we built that treehouse together? You were 6. It was too high, too crooked, and I think we both got splinters. But you wouldn't stop smiling. That night we sat inside it with flashlights, and I told you stories about the stars. That was the last day I felt like a real father. After that, the weight started piling on. The shop was failing. Your mother's health was worse than she let on. I made a desperate deal with the wrong people, and when I tried to undo it, they threatened to take everything, including you. So I ran. I thought I was protecting you, but I see now I was just afraid." Elijah let out a slow breath. The words didn't erase the pain, but they gave it form. And sometimes that was the only way to begin healing, by finally knowing where the ache came from. Maggie reached into a drawer behind the counter and returned with something wrapped in a faded cloth. She handed it to Elijah gently. "What's this?" he asked. "Something he left here," she said. "Said you'd know when to look at it." Elijah unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a photograph, an old Polaroid edges, curling from age. It showed his father, James, sitting on the front steps of a garage, laughing. His arm was around Elijah, who couldn't have been more than 7. The image was grainy, but the joy was unmistakable. Elijah's arms were wrapped around his father's waist, and James was pointing up at something just beyond the camera's view mouth, open mid-story. Elijah had never seen this photo before. A memory stirred not of that exact day, but of others like it. Summer evenings smelling of cut grass and motor oil. His dad whistling through the halls. A bedtime story about the moon being a lantern for lost travelers. They hadn't all been bad days. That was the lie he'd been telling himself for years, that it had all gone wrong from the start. But it hadn't. There were moments of real joy, of love. And that made the loss deeper, but also more human. Maggie placed her hand over his. "He didn't vanish because he stopped loving you. He vanished because he never stopped." Elijah felt his eyes burn, but he didn't look away. I used to think, he said softly, that if I ever found him, I'd scream, or hit him, or walk away without a word. And now she asked, I don't know. I want to understand who he really was. Maggie nodded, then read the journal. Finish the car. Drive it somewhere that matters. He'd want you to feel the road under your hands again, not as his son, but as yourself. Elijah picked up the journal and nodded. I will. Before he left the cafe, Maggie pressed something else into his hand. A small key, cold and thin. What's this for? There's a lockbox behind the wall in the back of the garage, she said. He told me not to mention it unless you were ready. It might have the rest of the answers. Elijah left the Crossroads Cafe in the early afternoon light, the photograph tucked into his wallet, the journal riding shotgun, the key pressed tight in his palm. When he looked at the hills in the distance, he didn't just see trees and roads anymore. He saw the possibility of peace. And he wasn't afraid of the next part. Not anymore. The sun was low in the sky when Elijah returned to the garage in Red Hollow. The soft orange light poured through the dusty windows, casting long golden beams across the concrete floor. It felt warmer than before. Like the place had shifted slightly, not physically, but emotionally. It didn't feel like a stranger's refuge anymore. It felt closer to home. He stepped inside slowly, every movement deliberate. The journal lay beside him on the passenger seat, but he didn't need to read more just yet. His father's voice was already loud enough in his mind. Instead, Elijah pulled the small key Maggie had given him from his jacket pocket and walked toward the back wall. The light switch clicked, humming to life. A dim bulb flickered above. Behind the shelves of tools and engine parts, a wooden panel looked different from the rest, less worn, almost newer, as if someone had replaced it, but hoped no one would notice. Elijah pressed his fingers along the edges, feeling for weakness, until the panel gave with a soft creak and swung open. Behind it, mounted into the wall, was a small metal safe. The key turned with a quiet click. Inside was a folder thick with documents, an envelope marked "Only if he asks," and a small black flash drive. Elijah carried the items to the old workbench and sat down. The room was still. He could hear the faint buzz of insects outside, the distant rustle of trees. He opened the envelope first, a single letter longer than the others. Elijah, I don't know if you'll ever see this, but if you do, it means you were braver than I ever was. By now, I imagine you've learned pieces of the truth. I left to protect you. That was never a lie. But I also left because I couldn't face what I'd become. I lost more than money. I lost trust. I lost parts of myself I never got back. There were people who wanted to use me, and I let them. I built cars that weren't just cars. They were compartments for things no one should carry: money, weapons, even people. At first, it was just debt. Then, it became survival. I told myself it was temporary, that it would end. But the end never came. Only the consequences. One night, I got a call. Your name had come up. They wanted leverage. Said they'd take you if I didn't fall in line. That was the night I left. Not because I didn't love you, but because I did. Tom helped hide me. Maggie helped heal me. But I never healed enough to come home. This drive contains everything: names, deals, places. I gave it all to a journalist once, anonymously, hoping something might change. It didn't, but I kept a copy just in case you ever needed to understand. Not to carry my burden, Elijah, but to finally set it down. You don't owe me forgiveness, but if you find any, I hope it brings you peace. With everything I have, Dad Elijah sat with the letter in his lap, tears slipping down his cheeks, unnoticed. His father hadn't just run. He had tried to end what he started, tried to leave behind breadcrumbs that might someday lead his son to understanding. He turned to the folder. Inside were old receipts, shipping manifests, photographs, evidence of the life James had hidden from the world, cars gutted and rebuilt with false floors, unmarked bills, surveillance photos of dangerous-looking men. and buried in the folder, a birth certificate, Elijah Carter, Father James William Carter, Mother Evelyn Margaret Shaw. Elijah blinked. Shaw. His mother and Maggie were sisters. He grabbed the journal, flipping back through earlier pages. Somewhere around the middle, one entry caught his eye. I never told you this, but your mother came from strength. She and Maggie were cut from the same cloth, fierce and kind, and too good for the world we were born into. When I couldn't protect you anymore, I turned to Maggie. I knew she would. I couldn't face her, but I knew she'd help you if you ever came looking. Maybe you already have. Elijah's breath caught. The woman who had comforted him in the cafe, handed him pie and memories and keys to the truth, was his aunt. And she'd known all along but waited for him to be ready. He stood up, pacing the room. Every emotion swirled in his chest: sorrow, awe, anger, confusion, and something heavier. Something lighter, too. The ache he'd carried for decades wasn't gone, but it had a name now, a shape, a story. He reached for the flash drive. He wouldn't open it tonight. He didn't need more details now. He needed one thing. He walked over to the car. The vintage coupe sat half-finished under the tarp he'd pulled off days ago. He ran a hand over the hood, something his father had touched. Something his father had started. A final project waiting to be completed. There were still parts to install, pieces to sand, paint to mix, but Elijah knew what he'd do next. He'd finish it, and he'd drive it, not to escape the past, but to carry it with him, gently, into something new. The days that followed became a quiet rhythm, sunrise coffee dust and tools. Elijah woke with purpose for the first time in years. He found comfort in the hum of the drill, the whine of a belt sander, and the rattle of sockets inside an old metal toolbox. The car, his father's final creation, was slowly coming back to life beneath his hands. Each piece he restored felt like a conversation between them, like father and son were finally working side by side again, across time and silence. But the truth he'd uncovered in the safe lingered. The flash drive, though unopened, sat near the workbench, waiting. The name Shaw etched into his mind like a scarred puzzle piece, finally snapping into place. Maggie, his aunt. He called her that night. I found it, he said softly when she picked up. Everything. The letters, the folder, the truth. There was a pause on the other end. Then her voice came steady and warm. I figured you would. You're my aunt. Yes. Why didn't you tell me? Because it wasn't my place. Your father asked me to give you space, not secrets. If you never came to me, I would have honored that. But if you did, I knew you were ready to hold it. Elijah closed his eyes. I'm not sure I am. Then take your time, but don't let fear stop you. That's what James regretted most, letting fear keep him from you. That night, Elijah sat under the stars beside the garage, a blanket around his shoulders and the journal open in his lap. The air smelled like pine and cooling metal. He turned to a later entry. The other garage was supposed to be ours, Carter and Sons. That's what the sign was going to say. I bought the land and started building it right before everything went wrong. When I fled, I left it all behind. It became my exile, a place I visited only in letters and memories. But I never let go of the hope that you'd find your way there. If you're standing in it now, you've already done something I never could return. So here's what I want from you now. Not more searching, not more pain. I want you to make this place yours. Not to bury my story, but to write your own. Elijah looked around the dimly lit space, the tools, the walls, the car nearly finished gleaming like the past made new. It wasn't just his father's garage anymore. It was his too. 3 days later, the coupe roared to life. It wasn't a perfect engine. The idle still stumbled slightly, and the upholstery could use more work. But to Elijah, it was symphonic. He sat behind the wheel, gripping the leather-wrapped steering wheel with calloused hands, staring out the windshield at the gravel road ahead. In the passenger seat sat the journal. In the glove box, the photograph Maggie had given him. His father pointing at the stars, laughter in his eyes. Elijah tucked the folded birth certificate behind it, careful not to wrinkle the edges. He turned onto the back road gravel, crunching beneath the tires trees, flying past in streaks of green and gold. The autumn wind kissed his face through the open window, and for the first time in years, he felt like he was moving forward, not just traveling, but healing. An hour later, he reached the town cemetery on the outskirts of Maple Ridge. The place was quiet. Rows of headstones nestled beneath ancient oaks, the late afternoon sun stretching long shadows across the grass. He parked near the edge, cut the engine, stepped out. The letter Tom had mailed him weeks ago had mentioned it. If he's truly gone, this is where you'll find him. I brought him home. Elijah walked slowly, heart pounding, toward the back of the cemetery, near a modest tree and an older section of markers. He saw it. James William Carter, beloved father. The road was long, but love never left. Elijah stood frozen. Then slowly, he knelt. He placed the journal on the stone along with the photo. I finished the car, he whispered. Took me longer than it would have taken you, but I got there. The breeze stirred, leaves rustled. I found everything. The letters, the safe, the truth. I don't hate you, Dad. I thought I did. For a long time, but I think I just didn't know how much you were carrying. He ran a hand over the edge of the stone. I wish we had more time, but I'll take what I've got. I'll carry it forward. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a wrench, the first tool his father had ever given him. The metal was worn smooth with use. He placed it at the base of the stone, resting it gently against the earth. For what you built, and for what you left behind. He stood, one last glance toward the marker, and then walked back to the car. As he turned the ignition and rolled down the windows, a song from the past played softly in his head, a humming tune his father used to sing when they worked side by side. And for the first time in 2 decades, Elijah sang it back. Back in Red Hollow, Elijah sat at the worn kitchen table in the back corner of the garage, the soft yellow glow of a single lamp washing over the journal, and a pile of letters yet to be opened. Some were yellowed, others newer. All were addressed to him, some in his father's bold, steady handwriting, others shakier, as if written with tired hands and heavier thoughts. He picked one up marked Elijah, age 18. He remembered that birthday well. He'd spent it alone in a diner, telling himself it didn't matter anymore, that he didn't need anyone, that he was already grown. He unfolded the letter. Son, you're 18 now. A man. And I missed it. I told myself I would show up this time, even if it was from a distance. I drove within a block of you, saw you through the window of a diner. You sat there like you didn't want to be seen. Or maybe you just knew no one would show. I wanted to walk in, just once, sit across from you, and say, I'm proud of you. Because I am. I know you've done this without me, and that breaks my heart. But I'm also proud. You've become the kind of man I always hoped you would. Steady, honest, brave. That night, I sat in the car for hours. I didn't leave until you were gone. I know it's too late to make up for birthdays and scraped knees and graduation. But if you'll let me, I'll try to give you something else, the truth. Not the polished kind, the real kind, the hard kind. I owe you that. And even if you never read this, maybe writing it makes me just a little more of the man I was supposed to be. Dad Elijah folded the letter carefully and set it aside. Every page felt like a whisper from a ghost, not haunting, but healing. The silence he'd lived with for so long was finally being broken by a voice that had never truly left him. He read letter after letter, covering years of his life. Letters for moments he never knew his father had witnessed. A letter from his high school graduation year, though he hadn't walked across the stage. One from when he turned 21, unopened for years. Another included a sketch of a garage blueprint with a note scribbled underneath. If I had stayed, this is what we would have built together. But maybe someday you'll build your own. Tears slid silently down Elijah's cheeks. His father had been watching, from afar, quietly, regretfully, and yet always present in the only way he believed he could be from the edges. Later that evening, Elijah turned to the last few pages of the journal. They were dated just a few months before his father's death. The handwriting was looser, shakier, but no less intentional. "I'm tired now, son. There are days I wake up and wonder if I made the right choices. If you'd been better off with a father who stayed and fought even if it meant danger. But then I remember the sound of your laugh, the way your hands moved when you held a wrench for the first time, the way your eyes lit up when we fixed that old radio together. And I remember that everything I did was because I loved you. If I could do it over, I would have found a way to stay. But the man I was then didn't know how. The man I became, he learned to write, learned to watch, learned to carry his love in silence. It was never enough, but it was what I had. And if you found these words, maybe love found its way back after all. I love you. Always have. Always will. Dad." Elijah closed the journal and placed it over the letters, resting his hand gently on the cover, as if to say, "I hear you now." There was nothing else to do that night. No more repairs to make. No more parts to sand. The car was finished. The silence was filled. But his journey, that was just beginning. He stood and walked outside, the night air cool against his skin. The coupe sat in the moonlight, polished and still. A monument, a memory. Tomorrow he'd put a sign above the door. He didn't know exactly what it would say, but it would mean something. And for the first time in years, he felt ready to write it. The next morning arrived quietly, with a veil of mist clinging to the tops of the trees and a coolness in the air that hinted autumn was preparing its exit. Elijah stood at the edge of the gravel lot in front of the garage, staring at the finished coupe. It sat there like a memory, made solid, sleek, clean, elegant in its simplicity. The dark green paint gleamed in the morning light, and the new tires hugged the earth like they belonged to it. He had polished the trim, tuned the engine, checked every bolt twice. And now, there was nothing left to fix. He slipped into the driver's seat, the leather sighing softly beneath him. The smell of oil and leather and pine still lingered faintly. Beside him on the passenger seat lay the photograph of him and his father, the journal. And one last letter he'd written, this one, his own. He had decided he would leave it at his father's grave. Not because James needed it, but because Elijah did. The drive to Maple Ridge took longer than usual. Not because of traffic, there was hardly any, but because Elijah kept taking the long way, turning down roads that reminded him of something, a shared childhood route. The hill where his father taught him to brake gently. The gas station where they'd once bought ice cream after changing a flat tire in the rain. Each corner, each mile, a memory stitched into pavement. The old roads whispered stories beneath his tires. When he arrived at the cemetery, he didn't bring the journal this time, just the letter. He carried it carefully, like it might dissolve in his fingers if he clutched it too tight. The headstone looked smaller than he remembered, or maybe he had just grown in ways he hadn't noticed. He knelt beside it again, the grass slightly damp beneath his knees. Elijah unfolded the letter and began to read aloud, voice soft and even. "Hi, Dad, I figured it was time I wrote back. For a long time, I carried around a version of you that was incomplete. A version built from absence, from unanswered questions, from silence. I told myself you didn't care, that you ran because it was easier. But I was wrong. You didn't run from me. You ran for me, to shield me from a storm I never saw coming. You were imperfect. You made mistakes. You hurt me even while trying to protect me. But you loved me. And that love never stopped. I see it now in the journal, in the photos, in the letters you never sent. I see it in the car we finished together. I see it in the family I didn't know I had. And I see it in the mirror too. You left me more than a name. You left me grit, patience, and the ability to keep going even when things feel too heavy. So, I forgive you. Not because you asked, but because holding on to the pain hurts more than letting it go. I forgive you, because I love you too. Elijah. He folded the letter and tucked it beneath a smooth rock at the base of the headstone. A simple human gesture. No grand speeches, no final monologue. Just a son, speaking back into the silence. The drive home felt different, lighter. He took the car out to the open highway, the wind rushing through the windows, the sun warm on his skin. He didn't think about the years lost anymore. He thought about the road ahead. Somewhere along the winding path, Elijah pulled off at a bluff overlooking the valley. Pines stretched below him like a green sea. He parked the car, stepped out, and stood at the edge of the overlook, the wind in his hair and the echo of his father's voice in his heart. The world felt vast and wide again, not as something to run from, but as something to step into. He didn't know what came next, but he wasn't afraid of it. He'd carry the stories, the pain, the grace, and the strength passed down to him through calloused hands and unsent letters. He got back in the car, turned the key, and let the engine purr beneath him. Forgiveness had wheels, and he was ready to drive. Weeks passed. The days grew colder. The leaves shifted from gold to rust, and the wind began to bite with the promise of winter. In Red Hollow, the garage became more than a workshop. It became Elijah's anchor, a place where the past could breathe without suffocating him. He kept the lights on late into the night, not because he had repairs to finish, but because it felt good to build something that would last. He started taking on small jobs, brake checks, oil changes, tire patches, for passing travelers and curious locals. Word spread quickly, not just about his skill, but about his kindness. People began to say things like, "He reminds me of James. He's just like his father, only gentler maybe." At first, the comparison made Elijah flinch, but slowly, it made him proud. He hadn't inherited James Carter's mistakes. He had inherited his love of fixing things, of putting broken pieces back together with patience and care. One evening, Maggie visited. She pulled up in a faded pickup, carrying a box of old photographs and a thermos of homemade soup. "You'll need these when the snow hits," she said, handing it to him with a knowing smile. They sat outside the garage on the porch step, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was painted in pastels, soft lavender and peach bleeding into each other. Maggie opened the box and began pulling out pictures. Some Elijah had never seen before. There was one of his mother and James leaning against a car hood laughing. His mother looked young and wild-hearted. His father, less weighed down. His arm around her like he believed the world couldn't break them. He loved her with everything he had, Maggie said. And when she died, "I think a part of him died too." Elijah nodded, still holding the photo. "I've been thinking of reopening the shop. Officially. Maybe even calling it Carter & Sons like he wanted." Maggie looked over her expression, softening. "You'd make him proud." "I don't know if I'm ready." "You're more ready than you think." They didn't talk for a while after that, just sipped soup from mugs, and let the quiet settle between them like an old friend. Before she left, Maggie handed him one final envelope. "He wrote this before he passed," she said. "He left it with me. Told me to give it to you only when I believed you were finally standing on your own." Elijah's fingers hesitated at the seal. Then he opened it. "Elijah, if you're reading this, you've made it further than I ever could, and I'm proud of you. I know those words don't fix everything, but I mean them. With everything I've got left, this garage was supposed to be ours. I'm sorry I made you wait so long to walk through its doors. But now that you're here, I want you to fill it with your life, not my shadow. You'll never need to be me. You've already become something better, a man with courage, with kindness, and with the grace to forgive. If you ever feel lost again, remember this. There's no shame in starting over, in turning a wrench and saying, 'Let's try again.' That's what mechanics do. And sons." Dad. Elijah folded the letter carefully and tucked it into the inside pocket of his flannel jacket. That night, he turned off the lights in the garage, locked the front door, and stood for a while in the gravel lot, under a sky full of stars. The car sat behind him, cool and quiet. A monument, a memory. Tomorrow he'd put a sign above the door. Carter and Sons, Auto Est, twice. Once by a father, and once finally by a son. Sometimes the things we inherit aren't money or houses, but silence. Unsent letters, unspoken apologies, unfinished conversations. Elijah Carter didn't set out to find answers. He just fixed a stranger's car on a rainy night. But sometimes, one act of quiet kindness is enough to stir the past, to open a door that's been waiting for years. He found his father, not in person, but in pages, in tools, in the echo of an engine that hadn't run in decades. And he found something else too: grace, the kind that doesn't shout, the kind that sits beside grief and says, "You don't have to carry this alone anymore." This wasn't just a story about a father and son. It was a story about repair, about what happens when we stop trying to erase the past and start listening to it instead. If you've ever felt like your story is too broken, too far gone, too late to begin again, let this be your reminder. There's always time to turn the key, to write the letter, to come home. Thank you for joining this journey. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing and sharing it with someone who might need it. Until next time, drive gently and never underestimate the roads that lead us back to ourselves.